Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very effective presentation. I am sure you had delivered what you intended to. I must add a couple of important points that he brought out. Water management. We were talking about infrastructure management or resources management. Water appears to be one of the most critical areas of concerns among the oil and gas industry professionals. A survey undertaken by Harvard Business School and that had come out. You spoke about a different mindset, and that speaks a lot about the kind of entrepreneurial passion that the Chesapeakes and the Michels of the world have, which perhaps the conventional or the international oil majors actually are trying to learn from those kind of ventures. Yes, the days of easy oil are a little far, and conventional is the word of the day. You brought in just something very interesting, pay as you go, and that actually explains a lot of things. With this very, very interesting opening, let me take this opportunity to invite the next speaker. We have amongst us Mr. Kaushik Deb, and we look forward to yet another interesting perspective on this topic. Mr. Deb, please.
Go forward, back, and this is right pointing up. Sure. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon now. Thank you for having me over. It's always fun to come and speak to a bunch of students. The way you are challenged when you're speaking to uncluttered and hopefully clearer minds than us is often the way that people like me move forward in life, doing more work that's useful. Also, my immense gratitude to Mr. Hussain for his presentation for several reasons. One, of course, his passion, which was very evident. Also, thank you, sir, for bringing in the safety moment, something that all of us in the oil and gas industry and colleagues like you will find of increasing importance as you go forward. But also, perhaps, giving me a nice introduction to what I would present. Unlike the past, where traditionally our focus in the oil and gas sector, especially when we've been looking at some of the political issues, some of the geopolitical issues, have been concentrated around North Africa and the Middle East, the last few years have completely changed the space of energy. The big change in the space of the hydrocarbon sector has been the emergence of unconventionals. Now, after hearing Mr. Hussain speak, the fact that this happened in North America, in the US, seems to be obvious. But trust me, with some of us with more gray hair than you, this wasn't so obvious to us 10 years back. And these new forms of energy, including what we've included here, renewables, which were not much in vogue 10 years back, would constitute a much larger share of the share of world energy production going forward. In fact, last year, 81% of the increase in total energy production came from these new forms of energy, unconventionals and renewables. The growth in energy availability also happens across the world. The only part of the world which does not grow in terms of energy supplies is North America. Where energy supplies do not increase is Europe, not North America. But every other part of the world sees energy supplies grow. The challenge, of course, is one of not energy supplies or the story around peak energy that we've heard that the amount of energy that's available to the world will go down, but one of availability of energy to every part of the world at every point in the future. So one more of energy security. And this is true for every form of energy. Liquids, that is oil, where a large part of the increase in energy supplies over the next few years will be in forms of energy that we are not so familiar with in the past. Tight oil, shale oil, NGLs, natural gas liquids, that is, biofuels. And in fact, about 15% of the total supplies by the year 2035 are expected to be of these new forms of energy. A large part of these forms of energy will come from North America, the US. But gradually, as we go forward, other parts of the world, China for instance, starts to play a much larger role. This holds true also for gas, where a vast majority of the increase in gas production is still conventional, is still in the Asia Pacific region, but outside our part of the world, the growth in gas production happens in the US, in shale gas. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean, especially in terms of geopolitics? What does it mean, especially in terms of the traditional, conventional areas of the world which have been supplying hydrocarbons to the rest of us? You see, of the total increase in energy consumption, oil consumption increases the slowest, just about 0.8% over the next 23 odd years, 0.8% per annum. This is because energy consumption or liquids consumption in the OECD, our characterization of the developed world, is declining. So it declines by almost 8 million barrels in this 23-year period from now to 2035 or so. Almost barrel for barrel, this is made up by an increase in consumption in China. So there's already a shift in consumption that's happening. The other parts of the world which need more liquid supply, i.e. their consumption of liquids goes up, India and the Middle East. The increase in supplies, though, that's happening, at least over the next few years until the end of this decade, is going to happen in North America. Record increases for the last 2 years, the biggest increase in any country, the biggest increase of all countries in the world in the last 2 years has been North America, something that was unthinkable 10 years back. And this continues into the future. But going even further forward, one expects increases in liquid supplies to happen in Brazil or in the form of natural gas liquids. That puts an interesting pressure on this part of the world that we call the Middle East. More politely characterized as OPEC, we expect that the demand on OPEC supplies will gradually be under pressure. There's a stated goal that OPEC has. They say that they are very comfortable with this $100 a barrel oil that exists today. They think the world can afford it. And they have production targets to be able to meet that. Now, as other parts of the world increase their supplies, that means the call on OPEC or OPEC's need to supply this market goes down. In any market, if you had a rapid increase in supplies like we've had with liquids over the last few years, you would see a downward pressure on prices. The fact this downward pressure on prices is not being realized and oil continues to remain at about $100 odd a barrel says something about OPEC's ability to manage production. Now, Economics 101 tells us that cartels don't work. Cartels fall apart because individual members of such a grouping have the incentive to break the cartel to earn more revenue by exploiting these higher prices. That's what puts pressure on OPEC. But that's also one aspect of this cartel that makes it unique. As the call on OPEC, as OPEC's need to supply the oil market falls, that means OPEC's excess capacity increases. To maintain a level of about $100 a barrel, that means that excess capacity reaches to about 6.5 million barrels by the end of this decade. That's a pretty high number. OPEC's ability to manage this, though, relies on one fact, that effectively all OPEC excess capacity is in one country, Saudi Arabia. So the decision to maintain this price level in some ways is just one country's decision. The last time OPEC faced such great pressures was way back in the 80s. Excess capacity at that time had reached well over 7 million barrels a day. But there was a unique thing about that period. That unique thing was the characteristic of demand. Demand itself was falling on the back of high oil prices that the previous decade had seen. But OPEC did manage to maintain some sense of stability even then. The piece that helps OPEC, and a rather unfortunate development around the world, is all the disruptions that we've seen in oil markets. Each one of us who looks at oil prices on a weekly, daily, monthly basis tries to correlate it with what's happening in all the major oil supply regions of the world. A tanker escapes from a port in Libya and suddenly oil prices around the world start to come down. Unfortunate events in Ukraine push up oil and gas prices in the spot market. Net cumulative since the beginning of the Arab Spring, there is about 3 million barrels of oil off the market. This includes Libya, this includes the birth of this new nation in Sudan, Syria, the sanctions in Iran. However, there is a curious coincidence playing out in the world. If, like me, you don't have much of a social life and spend too much time on the internet, you'd believe that this is the perfect conspiracy. Quarter for quarter, barrel for barrel, this disruption has been matched by an increase in supplies coming from the US. It's remarkable how both sides of the x-axis seem to mirror each other perfectly. So the net increase in production around the world has not been much. And given the rather stable level of consumption that we've had, the impact on prices has been marginal. But make no mistake, there is nothing that connects the positive and the negative quadrants here, except perhaps high oil prices, which continue to incentivize the animal instincts that Mr. Hussain so clearly articulated in North America, leading to higher productions of water. That leaves us on a market which is characterized by some analysts as being unprecedentedly stable. As a statistical measure, oil prices for the last 3 years have been the most stable since they have been since the 1970s. Again, a lesson in history for some of you. Before 1970, oil prices were really official prices, the official Saudi price or the official UAE price. There really wasn't a liquid market for oil as exists today with Brent or with NYMEX. So in effect, since the era of free oil markets, integrated free global oil markets has begun, we've had the most stable period in oil prices, hovering around $100 a barrel. But is this really stability? This is where you as analysts need to take a step back from numbers and statistics and see what this means. You have this situation where there is unprecedented increase in supplies, which by itself would have led to a downward pressure on prices, and unprecedented level of disruptions, which by itself would have led to a upward pressure on prices, being matched almost perfectly. So in some sense, we are just waiting for one of these sides to win and then prices to move. So this is not necessarily a stable market. The way we've characterized this is a market on a knife's edge, one of eerie calm, not necessarily of stability. And note here also, this is not just about an analyst or an economist like me, our ability constrained by our ability to predict where disruptions will happen. I'm no political scientist, and geopolitics is probably as far from my domain as close econometrics is. But every time I look at a disruption that's happened in the world of oil, right from Libya in the 70s to Iranian Revolution in 79, the fall of Soviet Union, the 2 Gulf Wars, none of these geographies came back to pre-disruption levels of production even after 10 years. So make no mistake, these disruptions are here to stay. But on the other hand, so are the rapid increases in production that we will continue to see in liquids from North America. A bigger challenge to the stability of global oil markets comes from OPEC as a grouping itself. As the rest of the non-OECD world, our characterization of the developing world, the Indias, Indonesias, and the Chinas of the world have rapidly increased their per capita incomes, OPEC per capita incomes are by and large stagnant at the 1970s level. Their population are expected to about double by 2035. Their consumption of oil is also increasing very rapidly because they have a fairly high energy intensive GDP growth. So which means you will have rapidly growing populations consuming large volumes of oil and gas with very little economic growth. As a result, you're going to end up with a very restive population. The Arab Spring didn't happen because one street hawker was beaten up by a woman cop. There's a nice characterization that this gentleman called Gulzar has in a film called Marches. कि आतंकवादी खेतों में थोड़ा ना पैदा होते हैं. And this is what you see, the makings of a perfect crisis that the world is realizing now. That's a bigger risk to the development of the energy markets. And something that percolates not just in oil, does not stay just in oil, but percolates to gas as well. Some of the biggest disruptions that we've had in LNG supplies, LNG, which is a form of natural gas that supplies a large part of the Asian market, have happened in these regions, North America and the Middle East. The unprecedented era of high LNG prices that we've seen for the last 3 years, that started with Fukushima making Japan an increasingly larger consumer of LNG, has meant that countries which can afford to and have an active policy of supporting gas consumption have benefited. China in 2013 had the largest increase in gas consumption in the world. They have a stated policy that they want to move away from using more coal and increase the share of gas in their energy mix. It's just about 5% right now, so you can imagine what is the volume of their ambition. The largest increase in consumption that happened last year. Also the second largest increase in gas production. But this wasn't enough to meet their large growing consuming needs. That meant a large majority of the increase in trade that happened in gas last year happened in China. Pipeline supplies coming from this nice little country called Turkmenistan. Also a very large increase in LNG supplies. And the Turkmenistan story is a nice one. Turkmenistan, for the first time last year, instituted gas price reforms. They started charging for gas consumption, which meant that gas consumption actually fell, and fell by almost the same amount that their pipeline exports increased. To where? China. So you can very well imagine big brother China leaning on little country Turkmenistan and saying, hey, you got a valuable resource and I'm willing to pay top dollar for that. What does this mean for a country like India, which now faces enormous challenges in increasing production? It also has the largest decline in consumption last year and is completely outcompeted from the LNG market, which are at very high levels. So puts a spotlight on countries that don't do very well in consuming this cleaner form of energy. There's an interesting story here on Russia and Europe as well. Russia was outcompeted from the European market in 2013. At that time, oil prices were still very high, and Russia has this arrangement that we will supply gas only by contract. The price of this contracted gas is fixed on the price of oil. So if oil prices are high,